top, and I can't figure out how to get it to come down, but whatever. I guess someone just rotated the whole thing up. Anyway, so today in this final sort of substantive lecture, I'm going to talk about taking all of the things that we have talked about over the course of the semester and looking at examples of how they can actually really be applied in some practical sense. And so we started the class by talking about a bunch of game theory models, which are very stylized, abstract tools for trying to understand things. And then, I think in the second half of the class, we kind of looked at how you can use these game theoretic tools to understand the results that you see from sort of standard psychological or behavioral economics type experiments done in the lab or done online. And then what we're going to talk about today is what are called field experiments. That is, experiments not run in an experimental context, but run out in the field. And so field experiments are, like I said, they're sort of done in the wild rather than in the lab. Typically, if you're going to run a field experiment, you're going to work in collaboration with some company, nonprofit, government organization, something that has some issue. And then a key element of the field experiments is not just that they're done outside of the lab, but that usually the people involved in the field experiments don't know that they're part of an experiment. It's just some kind of, you use randomization to change some feature of the way people are interacting with something, and then you look at the consequences for their real world behavior. And so not only are you looking at the behaviors that you actually care about, but also the people don't know that they're in an experiment, so you don't have to worry about sort of demand effects and people being weird because they know they're being studied. And so it makes the sort of results of these experiments sort of very directly relevant and useful. It's what we call ecologically valid. That is to say, when we do these lab experiments, you worry about ecological validity, but you'd be like, okay, we understand something about how people play prisoner's dilemmas in the lab, but how does that have to do, how does that actually connect to what they do in the real world? And these field experiments obviously don't have that problem because they are people actually doing things in the real world. So just as an example, you could think about the difference between people playing a public goods game where they're choosing how much money to give up for themselves to create, to do something that then get doubled and split equally by all the people in the group, which is supposed to be like a model of all kinds of behaviors that are sort of public goods enhancing, such as installing solar panels, which is at least short run individually costly, but good for the world. And so you could have people play a public goods game and look at what affects their contributions, or you could work with a solar panel installation company to try and study the actual installation of actual solar panels. And so this is the kind of thing that we're going to focus on today. These experiments are immediately practically useful for the partner organizations and for other sort of applied people who say, oh, okay, great, I can use this. And I think they're also really important for basic science, because in learning whether the conclusions that we've drawn in the context of the formal models in the lab generalize to the field, we learn something about the extent to which those models, that is, the game theory models are models in the literal sense, and the lab experiments are also still models in the sense that they're abstractions, abstracting away from all the details, and trying to capture something in some nice, tight experimental context. And so the key idea of models, as we talked about at the beginning, is that they're you want to simplify out the part that's not important and only capture the sort of key elements in your simplified model. But the only way you can know if you have in fact left out important things is to see how the results generalize when into the sort of most realistic situation. So in seeing how well stuff from the theory in the lab works in the field, we learn about whether the theoretical and the laboratory models were actually good models, or if something important is missing. So I feel like these field experiments are not only practically useful, but they're also theoretically useful. And there's a lot of different sort of cooperation applications that people have studied in the field. And just to give you a flavor of the kinds of things that will go on under that rubric, we've got looking at charitable giving or fundraising for public goods, like at community fire departments, police departments, schools, things like that. Blood donation is another sort of type of public good that is popular and that people have run a lot of experiments on. Efforts to reduce waste or energy use or water use, so just general sort of environmental conservation kind of things. Other kinds of conservation-related activities that, rather than sort of refraining from doing things, actively doing sort of environmentally positive things like installing solar panels or doing renovations on your house to make it more energy efficient. Voting is another major topic where there's been a huge amount of experimentation on getting people to vote. That is increasing turnout. Another thing which is maybe less obviously a case of cooperation or public goods, but I think really is, once you think about it, is a lot of healthcare, where people sort of tend to think about healthcare decisions of like, okay, I've been told to take this antibiotic for 2 weeks. Like, am I going to do it or not? Maybe that's not a great example, but so say certainly for tuberculosis, like when you get TB, you have to take this like quite unpleasant treatment every day for like months and months and months. And so that may feel like an individual choice thing of like, if I say, I'm sick of this, I'm not going to do it anymore, that's my problem, because then I get some bad outcome and I can make that calculation myself. But if you think about it, most healthcare things are not just individual choice problems, because if you do something that is, if you don't comply with your medical treatment regime, that's not only bad for you, but it's also bad for the people that depend on you or that have to take care of you when you get sick, and it imposes a cost on the healthcare system. And for infectious disease kind of things like TB, it also helps expose other people to getting sick if you are to get sick again. So I think that a lot of the things that we think about in the context of these sort of more obvious cooperation, public goods domains can also apply in the healthcare domain, particularly if doctors frame medical compliance as a public good to patients. And another thing that's like that in the same category is exercise. This feels like, oh, well, like if I want to exercise and be in shape or not, that's my own choice. But again, because it leads to bad health outcomes, that has consequences for other people. And another one is school performance. This is slightly more complicated, but like motivating kids to sort of do well in school and be engaged in school is also has some public good type element to it, in that it's beneficial for society, for individuals to sort of get good educations and then be able to sort of be as productive and contributory as possible. So these are all things that people have run a lot of field experiments on, and I'm going to tell you about examples for some of these categories. But there's another kind of cooperation field experiment that I'm very heavily involved in on a daily basis, which is trying to encourage cooperation between small humans, and they're pretty good at it. So I haven't really had to use many of the techniques that we're going to talk about today, because I don't know that they're really sophisticated enough to get it, but I'm sure as they get older. Well, that's not actually even true. You say things like, well, look, your brother's doing it. So that's using social norms, you know. Anyway, so we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so it says interventions to promote cooperation in the field, but this is this like overview, general overview chart of all the different kinds of experiments that people have done to try and promote cooperation in field settings. And we did this synthesis, or sort of say you can think about all these different kinds of interventions broadly in two different categories. And the first category, which I'm going to call cost-benefit interventions, these are the kind of standard economic incentives that you would employ if you were thinking about people as just basically either only caring about their own money or caring about their money and the welfare of others, so they do some kind of economic calculation and trade-off. And so one category of this is material rewards. So this is things like giving people cash in exchange for doing pro-social actions, or giving people gifts like the mug, the tote bag, whatever, that kind of thing, in exchange for contributing money or doing whatever pro-social thing. And another version of this is in particular in the context of charitable giving. You can try and increase the perceived efficacy of your actions, so that if you're doing some cost-benefit analysis where you're like, well, I care to some extent about helping other people. I also care to some extent about my own money, and so if you can sort of reduce the net cost to me by offsetting the cost with some kind of reward, or if you can increase the benefit to the other person, say using matching funds or seed funds for charitable contributions, or by doing some kind of language that makes it really emphasize how much need the person is in that you're going to be helping, that sort of makes the benefits seem larger. And so either reducing the cost or increasing the benefits can motivate people to give more, particularly if they're doing some kind of cost-benefit calculation. But and there's a ton of studies in this vein, and there are a lot of them that show these kind of things working, but there's also a lot of studies that find these kind of interventions not working, and particularly with material rewards, there's also some findings showing that material rewards can actually backfire, and people are sort of less prosocial when they're getting rewarded for it than if they're not. The theory being that to the extent that people behave pro-socially because they want to feel good or look good to other people, if you get rewarded for doing it, then that sort of extrinsic motivation destroys a lot of the ability for you to take credit for being good, for having done it, and so it undermines some of the intrinsic motivation to do it. So these kind of more traditional economic approaches are the things we are going to not focus on, and the things that we're going to focus on are what I'm going to call social interventions that come like much more directly out of a lot of the theories that we talked about in this class. And so there's two broad categories of these. One involve observability, and so these manipulations try to leverage reciprocity concerns and reputation concerns directly by making it so that your actions are more observable to the people around you, and therefore you're sort of more accountable for whether or not you behave pro-socially. And the other class of interventions are called descriptive norm interventions. And here, the idea is rather than telling other people that, rather than making it so that other people are going to know what you do and therefore your actions will influence your reputation, the idea of these descriptive norms is that you're told about what the other people around you are doing. And so the idea is, at a sort of proximate level, people are inclined to behave consistently with the way they see others behaving. So if you know everybody else is doing this thing, it makes you think that you should do it also. And that fits with it in a sort of more ultimate framework, or ultimate sense, within the reputation reciprocity type framework that we've talked about, which is that you have to know what the social norm is. Basically, if the general idea, for example, indirect reciprocity is, right, you have to comply with the social norm in order to maintain your good reputation, then knowing what other people are doing is a signal of the thing that you should be doing in order to maintain a good reputation. So what we're going to do, obviously not 100% of the time, but by and large, these sort of social interventions seem to be quite effective. And so what I'm going to do in the rest of today's lecture is we're going to talk in detail about some example of observability manipulations and some example of descriptive norms experiments. So starting with observability, one example, which was done here at Yale, this is the Dwight Hall Yale fundraising by Dean Carlin, who was here and just left and went to Chicago. They did this fundraising campaign where it was like a phone banking thing. They called all 4,000 some odd alumni that were associated with Dwight Hall, and they asked them to donate. And they had, like, every year Dwight Hall, or Yale, I guess, puts out some newsletter that lists
the names of all the people that donated at different donation levels, but that the fact that that exists hadn't previously to this been publicized as part of their fundraising efforts. And so what they did is they did 4 different experimental conditions. In the control, they just said to the people on the phone, we're hoping you'll continue your support to Dwight Hall with a gift of $100. Fine. Then in each of these sort of 3 different observability treatments, they emphasize to the people that whether or not they do this will be observable to other people because it will be listed in this publication. So 100 circle, they say we're hoping you donate $100, and say with a donation of at least $100, to become a member of our friend donor circle. Friends will be listed by name in the Dwight Hall Fall 2008 newsletter. 500 circle is the same thing, but it says you have to donate. If you donate $500, you'll be in the benefactor donor circle, and that will be listed. And then there's a 4th condition where they say both of these things. So they say, we'd like you to do gifts of $100. If you do at least 100, you get on the friends circle. If you do at least 500, you get on the benefactor circle. And so this is like a very explicit, direct observability manipulation where they're just saying to the people basically, hey, if you do this thing, it will be observable to people. And what you find is it makes a difference. So both in terms of the fraction of people that they called and decided to give, and also the total dollar amount raised per call. Sorry, it's off the chart a little bit, but basically it goes from around 11% giving in the control. The 100 circle didn't seem too much different, but the sample size wasn't huge for this, so they can't really say much about statistical differences between the different observability conditions. But if you just lump all of the observability conditions together, it looks like the 500 is doing better than the 100, but it sort of increases it from maybe 11% donating to, I don't know, 15% donating or something like that. And then when you look about the amount of money raised, that translates into a substantially larger amount of money raised per call. So, directly telling people, hey, there are going to be reputational consequences, in this case reputational benefits to donating, makes them more inclined to donate. But these things can work even if they're a little bit more subtle. So for example, in this study that my collaborator RSULE ran, he was trying to get people to sign up for what's called the demand response program. It's a thing where it's in California. On really hot days, people will crank up their air conditioners really high because it's hot. And when everyone does that, that creates a big spike in demand for electricity, and that can cause blackouts by overwhelming the power grid. And so this is a sort of classic public good type situation where it's individually beneficial to you to crank up your air conditioner, but if everyone does it, there's like a tragedy of the commons type bad collective outcome. And so the utility company wants to get people to not do that, and they've developed this technology called demand response, where if you agree to sign up for it, you agree to let them put a little machine onto your thermostat, so that it only works if you have central air, but in these buildings that have central air, you put in this little thing, and so then on really hot days, the demand response will automatically reduce the intensity of your air conditioner by a few degrees to prevent blackouts from happening. And so it sent over 1,000 people a flyer of this variety. I mean, if you have a chance to make a difference, it's free, it's easy, it's good for California, you have the power, blah, 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 and says sign up for this thing. And the experimental manipulation of observability worked as follows. In each case, in order to sign up for the program, there was a sign-up sheet posted in the mailroom of each of these buildings, and you had to sign up for it. And in the baseline, to sign up, there would be like a personal code that you would get on the letter, and you just had to write down the code and the date. And and then you'd be signed up. And in the observability manipulation, it was exactly the same, except in addition to your code, you also had to write down your apartment number and your name. And so in this condition, it's observable to the people in a given building who is and isn't signing up, whereas that wasn't true here. And obviously this randomization was done at the building level because, you can't have some people in the building, in a given building, getting this treatment and other people getting that treatment. And
So the question that, or the prediction obviously, is people are going to sign up, be more likely to sign up here than here, even though my guess is almost no one was explicitly thinking to themselves, oh, if I sign up for this program, my neighbors will see it and think well of me. It's just kind of like, this is not obviously a manipulation. If you get this thing in your mail, it's kind of natural, like, oh yeah, if you're going to sign up, you got to put your name on the sign-up sheet, sure. And so if you look at the fraction of the people signing up for the demand response program, it's like 3 times bigger in the observability condition compared to the non-observability condition. So that's evidence that this sort of social incentive was very powerful in this case. And then Eras also crossed this, was the signing up anonymous or observable? He also crossed that with whether there was a $25 cash incentive for signing up, which is what the utility company had been doing previously, being like, if you do demand response, we'll give you $25. That didn't do anything, basically. There was no significant difference in sign-up rates based on whether you got the $25 or not. And the size of this treatment effect, which was free, basically, from the utility company's perspective, was 7 times more effective than the cash incentive. So that sort of shows the power of this, not just in general, but also even relative to the more traditional economic incentives. And Eras said when he ran this, or he sort of proposed doing this, the utility companies said, there's no way that this observability thing is going to do anything. But okay, fine, whatever, we'll do it. They did it, it worked really well, and they didn't, and so to our sort of surprise, they haven't now adopted this as standard policy, because I think people's thinking is so ingrained that like financial incentives are the way to get people to do stuff, that like, that's one of the sort of frustrating elements of this that I'll talk a little bit more about later, is, hey, look, this thing's awesome. People are like, yeah, whatever, we're going to keep doing the cash incentives. But anyways, point is, from an application perspective, this suggests that this observability thing can be really powerful. And we also can say from a theoretical perspective, there's evidence from this study that it really is about some kind of a reputation concern, be it implicit or explicit, which is as follows. So if the idea of reputation is that, or reputation concerns, is that reputation concern can motivate you to do something pro-social if people that you care about are going to observe whether or not you do it, then we can show elements for these different key pieces. So for example, it's critical that other people see the sign-up sheet, right, for the reputation account, but it could be that if it's something just about like it's hard to remember the code, but it's easy to remember your name, then you could see this difference between treatments just not anything to do with reputation. But we can get that by comparing the size of the treatment effect for people that lived in row houses. So their like mailroom only was shared with, at most 1 or 2 other families, versus people who live in apartment buildings where lots of other people would see whether they signed up or not. It basically doesn't do anything in the house and has a big treatment effect among people living in the apartments. So that suggests it matters that other people see whether you signed up or not. And then the other thing is it should be people that you care about. That is, if you are worried about what other people in your building think of you, that should give you a motive to sign up when it's observable. But if you don't really care what the other people in your building think, then you don't care whether they're going to know whether you signed up or not. So we can compare renters versus owners, with the idea of being that renters are much more transient and probably less invested in their relationships with the other people in the building, and therefore the opinions of the other people in the building about them, compared to owners. And indeed, we see that there's not much of an effect for renters, but there's a big effect for owners. And then there was also another condition, which I didn't put in the slides, but where we didn't frame it as a public good. We're just like, hey, here's a new feature. Do you want to sign up for it or not? And again, for that, the observability didn't really do anything, because if it's not seen as a public good, then you don't see it. You're not seen as having a social obligation to do it, and so you don't care whether other people are going to know whether you did it or not. So this is all to say that you can get in this sort of more subtle implementation of observability. It can have big effects, and it can do so in a way that really suggests it's about reputation effects. But it can even be more subtle. So this is an experiment that Todd Rogers did, this professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard, who used to be the voting guy, and now he's the education guy, but this is from when he was the voting guy. And so they did this experiment where on voter turnout, and they mailed thousands and thousands of people these letters. They had a control condition where they didn't get any letter, and then they had this sort of best practices condition where they sent them the letter that they had optimized from all of their sort of previous voting experiments, which has a whole bunch of, it's like a kitchen sink kind of thing. For example, they told them that lots of other people would vote, which activates some of this descriptive norm, feeling like, oh, well, other people are going to vote, I should vote. They sort of tried to reinforce people's civic identity by highlighting that people, like, not just do people in general vote, but people like you vote. They asked them to write in a box like their specific plan for how they were going to actually get to the polls, which has been shown to make people more likely to actually vote. They expressed gratitude for their past political actions, and this is already starting to tap a little bit into observability in that they sort of reminded them that whether they voted or not would be a public record, and they hoped that that public record would show that they voted this time. And they also, if the person registered in the last election or voted in the last election, they thanked them for doing it. So these are all of their different sort of best practices. And so they've got the control, they've got this best practices version, and then they have another version that is exactly identical to this, except they add this one little box at the top that says, you may be called after the election to discuss your experience at the polls. And so I think this is a very subtle observability manipulation in that, like, I don't think that people reading this are like, oh, shit, I better go to the polls and vote in case this random person that I totally don't know at all calls me on the phone and asks how voting goes, and then I will have to either lie or say, oh, well, actually, I didn't turn out. It's you know, it's even more gentle than the apartment building one. So here's what they find. They compare their best practices one that has a little bit of observability and just, you know, one with the extra box, to just the sort of typical get out the vote letter that they've sort of measured the impact of from a big meta-analysis of a whole bunch of studies. So the typical get out the vote letter increases turnout by like 0.2% relative to getting no letter, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in tight races, you know, that's not nothing. And it translates into approximately $175 per vote if you count sort of how much it costs to make these mailers and send them out. Then their best practices baseline was, you know, doing more than twice as good as just a sort of typical get out the vote letter, and it cuts the price down to only $71 per vote. But this, just adding this one little box saying someone might call you to follow up, makes it even like much, it had like a pretty substantial impact on how effective it was, and, like, you know, cuts the price per vote almost in half relative to the other best practice, just the baseline best practice one. So here's another piece of evidence that this sort of very simple and subtle and totally free observability manipulation can have a big economically meaningful impact on people's behavior. So that's sort of the observability, some examples of observability. A little bit of social norms started sneaking in there, but now we're going to focus on more paradigmatic examples of descriptive social norms. And what you'll see is that, you know, descriptive social norms, it's like the converse of observability. And just to say it again, it's that observability is telling other people about what you are doing, whereas social norms is telling you about what other people are doing. And so the most famous example, I think, of the power of descriptive social norms, this concept is most associated with Bob Cialdini, and this super famous experiment. They were working with some hotel, trying to get people to reuse their towels, which is obviously good for the hotel, because the hotel has to spend less money on cleaning it, but it's also good for the environment, because then less water is getting wasted on cleaning the towels and so on. And so the baseline condition is they put these little, you know, like a door tag on in the hotel room. It says help save the environment, you know, and just some generic message being like, if you don't want the towel to get washed, you want to reuse your towel, just put it wherever. And then they compare that with, in one case, they add to this little tag some more text that says not only should you help save the environment, but it says, you know, in a study conducted some time, they found that 75% of the guests in this hotel participated in this thing and didn't ask for new towels. That is 75% of the guests reuse the towels, and so that's sort of communicating a descriptive social norm saying reusing towels is the thing that people do, the implied subtext being is the thing that you should do. And then they have another version that's even more targeted, where not just 75% of the people in general, but 75% of the guests who stayed in this exact room, room number, whatever, reuse their towels. And so that makes it feel even more like this is the thing that you specifically are expected to do. And what they find is that at the baseline, with just the standard message, a little under 40% of people reuse the towels, and this went up substantially when you said 75% of guests did it, and it went up even more when you said 75% of people in your room did it. And so it's evidence that this, that basically just telling people what others are doing, which from a sort of rational self-interest perspective, you might be like, I don't care, whatever. It's a matter to me if other people are suckers. I'm not going to reuse my towel, but people care. And this idea has been leveraged really successfully by utility companies. In particular, there's this company called O-Power that makes a service that utility companies buy from it that grew directly out of this Cialdini work. I guess that probably none of you guys have had utility bills because you all live in these Yale houses or not your own house, but one day you too shall get a utility bill, and probably it will look like this because this has gone, it's super popular and it's everywhere. And so the way it works is when you get your utility bill, in addition to telling you how much money you have to pay, it also compares how your usage was. So it shows you this is how much energy you use, this is how much energy your neighbors used, and this is how much energy your particularly efficient neighbors used. And then you can see it also on a month-by-month basis. You can see, oh, in August I wasn't really doing that bad, but yikes, when it got cold out, I started using way more energy than everybody else.
Why would utility companies be interested in having their consumers spend less? I get why it's a societal goal, but
so it's a good question, and I think that there's some. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know for sure. This thing that is coming into my mind that I can't source, and therefore I'm not 100% confident in it, is that there's some kind of government mandate to try and get people to be somewhat more efficient about it. But I don't really know. Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't know why they're doing it, but apparently they are, and they're paying O-Power to do it. So they give this social norm information, and then also on the back they show you how you're doing relative to your own self a year ago, and they give these tips on concrete ways that you can reduce your energy use and how much money it would save you. And so what Todd Rogers and friends did in this really cool study was they wanted to look not just at the one-time effect of this, but wanted to know what were the long-run consequences of this, and what were the long-run consequences if you were to give people this treatment for a while and then take it away. So this study spans 4 or 5 years with thousands and thousands of households. And what they do is, starting at this date, both groups of houses start getting these O-Power letters in the mail, and what you're going to see on the y-axis is the change in energy use relative to their average energy use in the earlier, sort of before this point. So basically, how much has their energy use changed relative to their historical energy use rates? And obviously, at the beginning, it starts out at 0 because that is their historical energy. That is, the point is, prior to this treatment, what are you at? And you're at what you were at prior to the treatment. But what you see is a quite substantial and economically meaningful decrease in energy use over a 2-year period of getting these mailers, and it's unclear whether this is sort of leveling out here or if they would have keep going further and further, but whatever. And then what they do is at this point in the continued groups, which is going to be in the black line, you see that they keep getting those mailers. and in the drop group, at this point, they stop getting the mailers. And so what you can see is for the group that keep getting them, this shows that it really is a leveling out, right? And so it's sort of after a year-ish or a year and a half, it's had whatever impact it's going to have, and then it levels out. And in the group that takes when you take the letter away, the effect goes away a bit. Some of their energy starts to increase again, but not that much. Like, this is pretty amazing to me that it looks like basically it's leveled off after, about a year, and like a full, pretty much 50% of the treatment effect continues even 2 years out after not getting the mailers anymore.
Is there a control group on here that doesn't get the treatment at all, just to see where they go?
So in this particular study, they don't do that. They're just comparing it to historical, but they have done other versions of this sort of thing with controls, and it's Anyways, so the difference between these two couldn't be about that. So I guess Anton's point is it could be that something happened over this 5-year period that just everyone was using less electricity at this point, so these guys would look the same as the controls. But I think they have some pretty convincing evidence that it's not that. Okay, so this is evidence that these social norms can have powerful and pretty persistent effects. But something that might occur to you in thinking about these descriptive norm experiments is this thing that is referred to as the boomerang effect. When you give it a descriptive norm, that is, you give information about what other people do, if you get information like the person in the example I showed you, which says, hey, you're using a lot more energy than your neighbors, that may lead people to reduce their energy consumption. But what happens if you get told, hey, actually, you're using way less energy than your neighbors? There's a concern that these descriptive social norms there might promote the bad behavior because you realize, oh, I'm actually being better than I need to. And there is evidence of this. This is, again, from that same O-Power type setup. They're looking at the change in energy consumption per day. This is in the short term, and this is over like a year or something like that. And so this is the change in energy consumption as a result of starting to get these O-Power letters. And what you see is that if you were an above average energy consumer, so if you were like a bad actor, then you reduce your energy consumption. But if you are a below average consumer, that is, if you're a good actor, then you do see this boomerang where people significantly increase their usage when they find out that actually other people are using more than them. And so what they showed in this study is that the boomerang effects can be counteracted by combining this descriptive social norm, which provides information about what other people are doing, with what's called an injunctive social norm. That is, information about what other people think, what other people approve of or disapprove of. So like you could think, often the thing that most people do is also the thing that people think is the right thing to do, but there are a lot of examples of behavior that's normative in one sense but not the other. So for example, in that demand response experiment that I talked about, this letting the utility company turn your energy down on, to turn your air conditioner down on hot days, that was non-normative from a descriptive perspective, and something like only 10% of the people in the building signed up for it. But it was normative from an injunctive perspective because of the language in those mailers really emphasized this is the right thing to do when it's good for California and so on. And then you can also have things the opposite, like texting while driving is something that is clearly descriptively normative, basically everybody does it, but it's also injunctively non-normative. Like people understand it's bad and they shouldn't do it, but everyone does it anyways. And so the idea in this paper, which then I think has become a general part of this this literature, is that the way to prevent this boomerang effect, the way to make it so that people that are doing well don't start behaving worse when they find out that other people are doing poorly, is to combine the descriptive and an injunctive norm. And the way that they did it in this O-Power thing is really extremely simple, but remarkably effective, at least in this example, which is they just put little smiley faces or frowny faces on it. So in this thing where you see the bar that says this is how much you're using
this is how much the average neighbor is using, this is how much the efficient neighbors are using. Then next to it, they would have like smiley faces if you were doing better than your neighbors, and like frowny faces if you were doing worse than your neighbors. And they found that that mitigated this boomerang effect. That now the people that were the sort of good actors didn't get worse when they found out that other people were behaving badly. And that's now a standard part of the O-Power letter, is these little smiley faces. Okay, so that's the sense of how these social norm interventions work. And another point to make is that observability and norms, not only are they the converse of each other, but they also interact in an important way, which is to say that, you know, as we said, both in these earlier slides and for like, you know, this whole course, observability and reputation concerns can promote good behavior, but that's only true if people think that there's a norm that stipulates that that behavior is required. So if you think about indirect reciprocity, for example, the key idea with indirect reciprocity, as I'm sure you recall, is that when in situations where the social norm says you have to cooperate in order to maintain a good reputation, then there can be an equilibrium where people cooperate in that, you know, when they are required to, but there's no point in cooperating if the norm doesn't require you to, because you're just throwing that money away. And so the implication of this is that making behavior observable in some kind of real-world field context is only going to increase the behavior in so much as people think that that behavior is normative in either a descriptive or an injunctive sense, and probably both. And the other side of that is that if there are behaviors that are counter-normative, then observability will depress the occurrence of behaviors that are counter-normative, even if those behaviors are actually good behaviors. And so, for example, there was a study that looked at charitable donations on college campus, like field experiment, but rather than being to the Red Cross or something like that, it was donations to the NRA, which is something that is the National Rifle Association, like pro-gun lobby, which is typically seen as like not a socially desirable or appropriate thing. And they're making the donations observable, so like making a list of the name of the donors made people less likely to donate, because there it's bad for your reputation to be associated with doing this, you know, still sort of pro-social in a certain definition behavior. And another one that was done in schools that was cool was getting kids to sign up for honors classes, meaning you had to come up to the front of the class in order to do the sign up versus being able to do it in some more anonymous way. And it was in like a middle school or high school or something like that, where like signing up for honors classes wasn't cool, and like only the nerds would do that. Or maybe it was honors classes or some like extra, like, you know, some extra academic thing that was clearly not cool. And so doing it in a way that you had to make it clear to all of your peers that you were signing up for it made people less likely to do it. So the key point of this is that observability isn't just like a total panacea that making things observable will make people more likely to do them, but it depends on what the underlying social norm is. Okay, so just to wrap up, I've made this, I've given you a bunch of examples of how these social incentives are really powerful, and I would suggest that in a lot of situations, these social incentives are actually more effective than economic incentives for getting people to engage in pro-social behaviors. And that makes sense if you think about the sort of motivation for behaving pro-socially as coming out of the sort of reciprocity and signaling mechanisms that we talked about in this class. And this could either be explicitly, so people, you know, directly thinking about their reputations, or it could be more of an implicit, internalized thing, you know, say intuitively implemented, like we talked about in the intuition deliberation stuff, where typically advantageous behaviors get internalized. And so it's typically important to be worrying about your reputation, so you wind up internalizing, you know, certain dimensions of sort of sensitivity to reputational cues. And so if a lot of the reason that people do pro-social behaviors is either explicitly or implicitly motivated by reputation concerns, then it's clear why observability should make you more likely to do it. and why social norms should influence your behavior. And as we just were talking about in the last slide, these things feed directly into reputation concerns. But this also explains why the material, like cost-benefit type economic incentives may not work that well for pro-social stuff in particular. Like, as I sort of alluded to at the beginning, material rewards can undercut the reputational benefits that you get for engaging in pro-social actions, because it makes it seem less clear that you were doing it because you were pro-social, and it makes your motivations more ambiguous. It might seem, well, you're just doing it because you actually wanted the reward, you didn't care that it helped other people. And so that undercuts the reputational benefits. And then increased efficacy, so matching funds or saying, oh, this person's really needy or this cause is really important, those kind of things are hard to observe by other people. So if you're thinking, I'm donating this money, or I'm doing this, donating my time to this thing, and at some either, again, explicit or implicit level, you're thinking, and that's a good idea because other people are going to think well of me for doing it. The fact that there was a 2x multiplier when you were donating, you know that, but like other people typically don't know that. And so, or even if they do know it, it's sort of, you don't get credit for it because it's somebody else's money that's being matched. So from a reputational perspective, you don't get extra credit for that. And so that might explain why these kind of things are not so effective. So just to summarize, I think that these social incentives, they're usually entirely free or almost entirely free, certainly less expensive than traditional economic incentives. A lot of the time they can have really large economically meaningful effect sizes, and they're less likely to crowd out intrinsic motivation to do pro-social behaviors, because a lot of the time you don't feel like the reason that you're doing it is reputation concerns. It's because it's happening at this more implicit level. And also, it can help establish sort of long-run changes in behaviors within communities, again, because it's observable, or because you're being told what other people are doing. It changes your understanding of what is the appropriate behavior within your community, which then can have long-run effects even after the interventions are removed, like we saw with the O-Power study. And so these, I think, are a lot of the reasons that social incentives are really great, and yet they're almost entirely overlooked by anybody trying to do anything in the real world, where there's this massive focus on traditional economic incentives using material rewards. So as you guys go forth into the world and try and do good things out there, you should remember that social incentives can be really powerful tools for getting people to do good things. So next class we'll do a review for the final, and then class after that for the final. Thank you.